Lee Badgett. I'm a visiting professor here at the Williams Project. And I actually came here from Massachusetts, which was a very interesting experience to leave one little bubble of equality, drive all the way across the country to another little bubble of near equality with regard to lots of different LGBT issues, and realize in between that there's this vast chasm where legal rights or responsibilities are definitely a thing of the future. But being in these bubbles makes me think sometimes that we can count up good court opinions, we can count up good changes in laws, and think that all is well with the world, and all we have to do is just wait things out a little bit longer, and we'll see equality spreading without any real resistance over time. But then I read public opinion polls and realize that maybe we have a lot more work to do. And certainly the last discussion suggested a couple of ways that public opinion matters very directly, even in the judicial process. Public opinion and polls on things like marriage are seen really by the right wing, I think, as their ace in the hole, because they can say, let the people decide. That's what they're saying in Massachusetts. Or here they can say, let's defer to the legislative process. Or leaders of organizations can say, my membership won't support me even though I'm with you. So understanding public opinion, how that's shaped, is obviously a very important task for us to figure out how we deal with this headwind that our movement faces. And fortunately, we have a couple of the leading scholars on public opinion issues with regard to sexual orientation with us today. One's an old friend, Greg Lewis, who's a professor of public administration and urban studies at Georgia State University. And I first got to know Greg's work on discrimination in the federal workplace. He's done work on race and gender and sexual orientation discrimination in that context, and more recently has turned his attention to issues of public opinion. Nate Persily is a professor of law and is a political scientist also. He's at University of Pennsylvania, and he's on leave this year at Stanford. So there's lots of other really wonderful things about these people that you can read, but I'll save our time for their presentations. And then finally, Gary Gates, who's a senior research fellow here at the Williams Project, will try to put this into some other larger context with some of the things that he's been thinking about. So we'll have a couple of presentations that are long, one brief one by Gary, and then hopefully we'll still have some time for some discussion. So I will turn it over to Greg Lewis. Thanks.
And I'm going to echo several of the remarks that were made in the last panel, but I'm also probably going to be less optimistic about changes that have been occurring and how quickly change is going to occur than the last panel was. The first argument that I'm going to make is that attitudes towards same-sex marriage are looking much more like attitudes towards same-sex sex than they are attitudes towards gay rights, and that we're seeing a lot less progress on same-sex marriage. So there are a series of public opinion polls that have asked good questions on employment discrimination going back to the mid to early 70s. Gallup has asked whether homosexuals should have equal rights in terms of job opportunities. We've seen a 30 percentage point or more increase over the past 30 years that's been fairly steady over the entire period. Likewise, they asked whether homosexuals should be hired as elementary school teachers. Very little support for that back in the 1970s, but we're up to a point where there seems to be clear majority support. Again, fairly steady increases. This is true on a variety of questions about college teachers, about the military, of course, with the drops during the time that was really in the news, and doctors, a variety of other issues. On the other hand, when we ask people about homosexual relations, they're much less approving, and there's been much less mobility. The General Social Survey since 1977 has been asking whether sexual relations between two adults of the same sex are always wrong, almost always wrong, only wrong sometimes, or not wrong at all. From 1973 to 1991, it was consistently above 70%, saying that homosexual relations are always wrong. That actually increased in the 80s, probably due to AIDS. And then we saw a really dramatic change between 1991 and 1993, a drop of 9 percentage points, which is phenomenal given this series. Another drop a few years later, and then it's been quite stable since then. The issue that I want to focus on is whether homosexual relations are morally wrong, and unfortunately there's not a really good series that asks that question. In general, fewer people say that homosexual relations are morally wrong than say that they are always wrong, but that percentage has been more stable in general, though I'm discovering a few more polls from the 80s that suggest maybe I'm not quite right on this. But you'll see that in 2004, virtually the same percentage were saying that homosexual relations are morally wrong as were saying it back in 1978. So almost no progress on this issue. There's been a little more progress on whether homosexuality is an acceptable alternative lifestyle, but that also has been erratic. And the series that probably is the most erratic is whether homosexual relations should be legal or not. And you can see that that's kind of all over the map. In 1987, only 33% said that we should be able to legally have same-sex sex. Rises to about 60% before the Lawrence decision, drops fairly dramatically, but fairly briefly. And I think actually, I'm suspicious of that 60% number. I think that was kind of a fluke. All right. So in trying to determine whether we've had progress in attitudes towards same-sex marriage, I did a search using the Roper Center to try and locate all the national surveys that have been asked that ask whether homosexual couples should be able to marry legally, and found 94 of them. And was able to obtain the actual data for about half of those. And this is the general sort of trend that we're seeing here. And it's really harmed by the fact that we've only got 2 polls before 1990. And it's also hurt by the fact that we've got 90 different polls, but probably 50 different questions, which makes it really difficult to even detect trends. If I just sort of treat a positive response as a positive response, we're seeing sort of a 0.3% percentage point increase per year over the last 10 years or so. But when I try a second method, which is to actually get the actual data from the survey itself, put it together in one mass data set with about 50,000 observations. I put in a time trend. I put in some corrections for different question wording. I look for a linear time trend while also allowing for drops in 1996 and 2004. Seems to be the case whenever our issues are on the front pages, it hurts us in terms of public opinion. Public opinion goes down briefly and then typically goes back up again. And in one model, what I did was I put in dummy variables for the different states. And it seems to work reasonably well in terms of sort of predicting which states are more supportive and which are less supportive. So this is my estimates for whether people would answer a question, whether marriages between homosexuals should be legally valid with the same rights as traditional marriage. And what I find for 2004 is D.C., we've got majority support. Massachusetts, we've got almost majority support. And then there is 10 states that are in the 40s, and it goes down from there. The blue states here are all states that have passed non-discrimination laws. The red states are the ones that passed by ballot initiative constitutional amendments against same-sex marriage in 2004, 2005. So you'll see California's in the top 10, Georgia is in the bottom 10. And it's a little disturbing to see so many of my neighboring states with 20% support for same-sex marriage. But anyway, so this is a little bit of a test of the validity of this method. It seems to deliver results that look appropriate, at least in my sense of where the states are. When I control for the states and allow for a drop in 1996 and 2004, I'm seeing a very clear drop in 1996 and 2004, and I'm seeing a positive time trend which is not statistically significant, meaning we can't really trust it. We can't really trust that the data are telling us that there's been progress on this issue. In a second model, I am also controlling for the year people were born, their gender, their race, their education, and their political ideology. And those things turn out pretty much the way we would expect. Women much more supportive than men. Whites being more supportive than blacks or the residual group. Positive impact of education. Clear ideological differences. And here, the point estimate gets larger but remains statistically insignificant unless I substitute age for year of birth, in which case I see a statistically significant increase, but it's due to that dying out factor that Pacey mentioned in the previous panel. All right. So the second thing that I'm going to do is try to tie together more closely moral judgments of homosexuality and attitudes toward same-sex marriage. And I'm going to argue that the moral judgment is crucial in same-sex marriage in a way that it isn't in non-discrimination laws. All right. And I'm going to be working here with 3 recent polls, and I've got the exact question wordings that they used for my key variable here, the moral judgment. The Los Angeles Times poll asked, do you personally believe that same-sex relationships between consenting adults is morally wrong or it is not a moral issue? And 48% say morally wrong. CBS New York Times gave people a choice between morally wrong or K or don't you care much either way, and we got a whopping 13% who said homosexual relations were okay, but luckily a third of people don't care whether they're morally wrong or not, and half say that they are morally wrong, and 55% consider it a sin to engage in homosexual behavior, and we've only got 33% who say it's not a sin, okay? And what I'm going to be doing is a Logit analysis. I've got a dependent variable which is opposition to same-sex marriage, also opposition to other sorts of gay rights issues. And these are the control variables that are in there. The main thing is I've got the usual suspects in here. I've got whether homosexuality is something a person is born with or whether it's a choice, whether people can change their sexual orientation, whether you know someone gay, and then I've got education, age, ideology, political party, a wide variety of religion measures, and gender and race. And this probably tells the story as well as anything. If people think that homosexual relations are immoral or a sin, it's no longer, it doesn't seem to be true that a majority of them still support gay rights across the board, right? Only 27% would oppose a law prohibiting anti-gay discrimination. A third believe the Army should be able to discharge gay soldiers. A large minority would object to a gay elementary school teacher if they had a kid who was that age group. But 2/3 of them oppose any form of legal recognition of same-sex relationships, and only 3% favor same-sex marriage. In the CBS poll, we see that if people think homosexual relations are immoral, the vast majority of them think they should be illegal as well. And virtually all of them think that we should not be able to get married. Same sort of pattern in the other poll. Among people who don't think it's a sin, this was actually the thing that was kind of surprising to me. If it's not a moral issue, 95% believe that we should be able to at least have civil unions, and half think that we should be able to get married. If people say that homosexual relations are okay, 90% of them support same-sex marriage, and 56% support even if they don't care whether it's morally wrong or not. And if people say it's not a sin, it's 4-to-1 that they're going to support same-sex marriage. Okay. What's going on in this table, I'm looking at the Los Angeles Times data, And you want to be looking across that top row. The bigger the number is in that top row, the worse it is for us, right? And so we've got a very significant, very large effect on marriage, also on civil unions, constitutional amendment, slightly weaker elementary school teachers, and actually no significant impact on whether they would oppose a job banning discrimination against gays. To try to translate that into numbers, this methodology makes it doesn't give us a very natural number to work with, but I work with a base individual who's a white female Protestant who doesn't go to church every week and is a moderate and an independent, so on and so forth. She has a 70% chance of opposing same-sex marriage if she thinks that this is not a moral issue. If she thinks it is a moral issue, she's got a 97% chance of opposing same-sex marriage. And you can see that that the effect of the morality variable is probably strongest on marriage here in this data set. Pretty much the same story in the other two data sets. In this case, the base person, if she thinks homosexual relations are okay, she only has a 15% chance of opposing same-sex marriage. If she thinks they're morally wrong, it increases the probability by 75%. So she goes from 15% to 90% likelihood of opposing same-sex marriage, and a similar sort of pattern in the other data set as well. The main sorts of points that I'm drawing are that the moral judgment has a huge impact on whether homosexual relations should be legal, whether we should be able to have civil unions, whether we should be able to get married, and whether there should be a constitutional amendment. It has a much weaker impact, at least in the one data set that's got good alternative sorts of gay rights issues, on discharging gay soldiers, preventing gay teachers, housing and employment discrimination. I'm not able to show you this up here, but in every marriage model, the moral judgment is the most important variable, and that's when we put whether homosexuality is a choice, whether it's changeable, whether you know gay people into the model as well. Okay. And it always has its strongest impact. It has its strongest impact on same-sex marriage, and it is the most important variable on same-sex marriage. Once the moral judgment is in there, as well as whether sexual orientation is a choice and whether you know someone gay, oddly enough, education has no real impact beyond that. It seems like education has got its impact through the moral judgment, through the belief about that homosexuality is something we're born with, and knowing someone gay. Age, on the other hand, has a very strong impact even after controlling for all these factors. Conservatism has a very strong impact after controlling for all these factors. Religion actually has a fairly weak impact once these are controlled, as do race and sex, so that most of what's going on in terms of religious differences, in terms of gender and race differences, seems to be precisely in the moral judgment of homosexuality, which again is most important for same-sex marriage and less important for a lot of other issues. And actually, I'm done on time. All right, and that's it. All right.
Hi, I'm Nate Persley. This is a paper that's co-authored with two grad students at Berkeley, Pat Egan and Kevin Walston, and we have tried to assemble a similar number of polls as Greg did. First of all, let me thank the UCLA and the Williams Project and Mr. Williams. This is a unique undertaking, both, I should say, as someone who's been at about 4 or 5 different law schools. It's unique not just in the area, but also in its sort of institutional vision, and so I'm really proud to be a part of this. And this is a giant project that we're trying to undertake here. It is part of a even larger project that looks at the effect of court decisions on public opinion. And so while I'm going to constrain my talk mainly to the recent court cases and their effect on public opinion on same-sex marriage, as well as to some extent on the homosexual relations questions that are asked by Gallup and others. We can talk about, well, how different is this than Brown versus Board of Education, Roe versus Wade, death penalty cases, et cetera. But let me just start by discussing different theories of how courts affect public opinion. First of all, courts generally have no effect on public opinion, right? What courts generally do, the Supreme Court in particular, is issue opinions that no one pays attention to, right? Except maybe the litigants in the cases or those who are intensely interested in the issue. For the most part, what courts do is below the radar screen. It's only elites that are paying attention to what it does. That's 99.9% of the time, right? Then there are the theories that courts actually lead public opinion. Right? This is sometimes trotted out with Brown versus Board of Education, that the court, in a sense, pulled the country along and the country followed. Frequently, we will hear warnings, though, of another theory, which is backlash, right? That the court issues its opinion and then the public reacts against it. Now, it's kind of interesting. I'm going to talk, when I talk about the effect of court decisions on public opinion, I actually don't mean the effect of court decisions themselves on public opinion, right? Because if the court sort of issues a decision in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, there is no sound, right? We're talking about the way elites bat around the issue as prompted by court decisions, right? And then the effect that those signals have on the mass public, all right? And so one final possibility is not that there are aggregate shifts in favor of the court's opinion, against the court's opinion, but also that the structure of opinion changes, that people polarize, that different groups begin to take different positions. That is actually what I think the best study in this area has found with respect to abortion, at least over the medium term, is that different groups filtered themselves out. All right. Now I'm gonna throw up a lot of graphs, some of which duplicate what Greg did, and so I'll go by some of them quickly. But in case I don't get to all the findings, let me tell you what they are now. First, it's quite clear that post-Lawrence versus Texas, that the public was willing to express anti-gay opinions on issues of sex and marriage in the period beginning with Lawrence, extending through the two Goodridge opinions and through the 2004 election. Okay, that backlash on same-sex marriage appears to have subsided and maybe even reversed a little bit. I wouldn't go so far as to say that because we don't have enough polls, but it appears to have subsided at least by the summer of 2005, where opinions are pretty much where they were pre-Lawrence. Okay. Now, in the 2 years since Lawrence, an increasing share of the American public expressed favorable attitudes on civil unions. So one of the findings I think that we come out and say in this paper is that one of the effects of the discussion of marriage has been to force Americans to negotiate a middle position in their mind, which they might have been off the table and controversial before. I mean, even the president at one point sort of seemed to come out in favor of civil unions. And so we find a quite significant rise in people's favorability in civil unions over the same period when they're backlashing on marriage and on same-sex sex. Now, in the 2 years following Lawrence, the issue of same-sex marriage became ideologized. All right, this is, I think, the I don't know. This is maybe the bigger move that this paper is trying to make, and we have some semi-fancy statistics looking at this. What happens when the court enters the political fray here? And what we find, and this is consistent with what Greg's last slide was, and he's looking at the polls at the end, is that education became less a predictor of your opinion on same-sex marriage, and ideology became an increasing predictor of your opinion on same-sex marriage. All right, and there's a theory here that I'll go through further that makes some intuitive sense. That what happens when courts have these issue these opinions, these decisions that have high salience and media attention, is that they force people who haven't been paying attention to the issue to start paying attention to what their ideological opinion leaders are telling them. All right, so then the less educated people then to map on to the more educated people as to how ideology affects their opinion on same-sex marriage. And then finally, we find the same things that Greg does with respect. We have some other, I think, interesting little variables and indices, but it's basically the same cross-sectional story that he tells. Just quickly, the share of, on the question about legalizing sexual relations, or as the Gallup Poll says, homosexual relations between consenting adults, both after Bowers and after Lawrence, people become more anti-gay in their opinions on this. Right? And, you know, it's a relatively significant amount. And so you have sort of two stories there. One, you might say that there's a legitimation story happening after Bowers, right, that the court is actually leading the public. And you might have a backlash story post-Lawrence. Here's the story that Greg was telling, depicted graphically, so that if you look at the green line at the top, Lawrence versus Texas is right at where the 59 is, and then there's that pretty precipitous drop, okay, on the question, do you think homosexual relations between consenting adults should be legal or not? Okay, all right, now here are a lot of lines. Okay, so let me walk you through them. Because I'm used to giving this presentation to law professors who think that public opinion is astrology to begin with, right? And I'd say, no, it's more like astronomy, which is, you know kind of where the star is. You don't know exactly, but you have to sort of use different telescopes. And so we have several different telescopes that are working here, and some of which Greg referred to in his paper. The green line, the red line, and the blue line are all measures of antipathy toward gays. All right, so the first one is whether, is the always wrong question that Greg referred to. The red line is basically how warmly do you feel toward gays is the question that is asked by the National Election Studies. And then the Gallup Poll is the one we were just talking about, which is whether same-sex sexual relations should be legal or not. Greg hinted at this in his talk, which is we have an interesting finding in this, which maybe people assumed, but we notice this giant drop here, okay? Bowers happens 1986 or so, right? And there's still this rise in anti-gay feeling, right? We graph the percent of stories that refer either to gays or homosexual that also mention AIDS, okay? So the question we're trying to ask here with this black line is, to what extent when you're thinking about gays, right, or when the media is reporting about gays, are they also sort of associating it in the public mind with AIDS? Okay, so the percent of stories, and that's referred to on the right side axis. And you notice that how well it tracks the blue line, right? That as the percent of stories that are associating those two things together drops, so does people's opposition to same-sex sexual relations. Pat Egan, incidentally, I get no credit for this. My co-author, Pat Egan, thought of this, and it was, I thought, a really interesting finding. The gray line asks the same question: what percent of stories that mention gay or homosexual are also mentioning marriage? And I'll refer to that in a while. Needless to say, you know, we have the backlash story that we were talking about before. But here's another sort of fortunate poll that we had. There actually was a poll on same-sex marriage in the field at the time of Lawrence. Okay, so think of this as a kind of EKG of the American people, right? And on same-sex marriage. So you're asking a few hundred people every day, and you get a sense. It's rare that you're going to have this opportunity. You've got an opinion that comes down, and boom. Actually, the share of the people, at least in a temporary way, those who are paying attention to the news, right? Or I shouldn't say those who are paying attention to the news, that the news seems to have an effect on some subset of the American people, and raises their total opposition in the short term there. All right, this is just in the week or two following Lawrence. Now, what was Lawrence? You know, one of the interesting findings that at least surprised me, and I think have surprised people who've heard this paper, is that the beginning of the backlash is after Lawrence, okay? It is not after Goodrich. It starts happening in the summer of 2003. Now, why might that be? Well, this graphs media coverage of same-sex, of sodomy and gay marriage, all right? And you'll notice that Lawrence was characterized in part as a marriage case, right, by the media, so that there's a real spike in attention and reporting on same-sex marriage post-Lawrence. It then goes up later on. That's the bigger bump around August is when the Catholic Church comes out with its sort of document condemning same-sex marriage. And then this is the story of media attention across the last 2 years. Now, Lawrence is back down here. The March of 2004, I mean, here you've got the first Goodridge opinion. Then in March is when you have all three things that are happening at the same time. You've got the second Goodridge opinion. You've got the San Francisco issuing its marriage licenses. You have the President Bush coming out in favor and advocating for a constitutional ban on same-sex marriage, all that happening. And then you see the reporting on the 2000 election where everyone says moral values are what did it, right? Which incidentally, I think Simon Jackman at Stanford has proven, actually empirically proven, that actually that George Bush did not win the election based on same-sex marriage. I can talk about that in a second. He's got some fancy statistics that prove that. But anyway, it's quite clear that the reporting of the 2000 election was in part framed by same-sex marriage, all right? And then, so this is the story of the backlash. This is just the Pew poll that within, you have the Lawrence opinion, then people backlash, now they're sort of coming back to earth. And you can take an even longer view, and this is where we throw in as many polls as we can find. You see the hiccup at the end, but for the most part, people are on the trajectory that they were. But again, we don't know what these last few polls in 2005 tell us, because we really don't have enough information. And this is just graphing basically the same type of poll graph that we were talking about with respect to AIDS coverage. This is with respect to same-sex marriage. So that people's hostility on the issue of same-sex marriage seems to map relatively well on the amount of coverage that the issue is getting. All right. But who's backlashing and how much? Most of the backlash is among those people who strongly oppose gay marriage, which is to say, not that they are changing in their mind, but the share of people who strongly oppose same-sex marriage can explain most of the backlash. So the Pew poll asked you strongly favor, oppose, or strongly oppose same-sex marriage. And you'll notice while there is some action, for instance, in the number of people who favor it going down, and a little bit of movement here with those who strongly favor it going up a teensy bit, most of the movement is up at the top, which is the share of the population that strongly opposes same-sex marriage, okay? Going up and then again, coming back down in the summer of 2005. All right, so here are this is what I call the spaghetti graph, but don't only pay attention to the top two lines for now. But we're doing the same kind of regressions that Greg is doing. We're doing it over time, over all of these surveys, and this is the story about the ideologization of the issue, okay? So ideology is the top line, education is the second line, right? Notice that education becomes less of a predictor over time and ideology becomes more of a predictor, okay? Now so people, the hypothesis is that people are taking signals from elites on this, that they're opinion leaders, and liberals are behaving more like liberals did before, which is to say educated liberals before, and then conservatives are taking more predictable conservative positions. All right. Now, there's other stuff to tell the story here. What's happening with age? Why is it jumping around so much? And I don't really have an answer to that, except that I don't think age is a continuous variable here. I mean, I don't think that its effects are linear. I don't think that the older you are, necessarily, the more anti same-sex marriage you are. I think there's some kind of heterogeneity in there that we don't really quite understand yet. All right, what happens with civil unions over the same period? For the most part, as you can see, post-Lawrence, there is a backlash on civil unions short term, but then as marriage becomes the issue on the agenda, actually it goes up. Okay, that people become a larger share of the population becomes more in favor of civil unions, and there are lots of different ways to phrase this question, and the more that you phrase it in terms of the individual rights that are at issue with the civil unions as opposed to something like civil unions or domestic partnership, the more that people will be in favor of it. What about a constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage? Now, this is all over the map. But it tells a story that's somewhat similar to what Kathleen Sullivan was talking about in her talk, which is that if you phrase the question on a constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage as, are you in favor of an amendment that defines marriage as between a man and a woman, and therefore prohibits marriage between two people of the same sex? All right, you're going to get 60% who are in favor of something like that. If you phrase the question, are you in favor of a constitutional amendment that would ban states from legalizing same-sex marriage, it's going to drop down to the low 40s. Okay, so there is some kind of federalism component to American public opinion on this that we haven't quite, I don't think scholars really have quite figured out. Okay, the story, and I'll end with this. I've got more slides, but I can maybe use them in response to questions. The story with respect to the multivariate analysis is similar to what Greg suggests. We do a little bit of a different method. The only differences, I think, between our stories that we throw in libertarianism, belief in limited government, and we have an index of moral traditionalism as opposed to sin, which he was suggesting. We find that libertarianism has the expected effect, which is that the more libertarian you are, the more likely you are to actually support same-sex marriage, right? And when I say expected effect, maybe the true libertarian position is that the state shouldn't be involved at all in marriage, but leaving that aside, libertarians are going to be more in favor of same-sex marriage. And we even control for people's attitudes toward gays, right? So the feeling thermometer question, and we find a lot of this is still statistically significant, all right? So that even when you control for how warmly people feel toward gays and lesbians, a lot of these other factors remain significant.
In 1990, only about 10% of same-sex couples were raising children, compared to well over half of their married counterparts. In 2000, it was all over a quarter of the same-sex couples are raising children. Compared, and the child-rearing rate among married couples actually went down. So that gap, in essence, was, while it was going up in same-sex couples, it went down in different-sex couples. Let's look at home ownership. It was a little over half of same-sex couples in 90, over 3/4 of married in 2000. There was increases in home ownerships in both groups, but it was faster rate among same-sex couples. Home ownership is often viewed as kind of a proxy of stability in relationships. Finally, let's look at living in a metropolitan area. In 1990, it was over 90% of the same-sex couples, about 3/4 of married couples. In 2000, same-sex couples were less likely to live in a metropolitan area, while their married couples became more likely to live in a metropolitan area. So, why is it that gay people are filing lawsuits around marriage? I would argue that's a very complex question, but one tiny component that I would isolate is that the visible gay population has a very different political agenda in 2000 than it did in 1990. The visible gay population, the people coming out, who are coming out precisely because of the successes in the early 90s, feeling more accepted, changes in public opinion about acceptance of gay people in general, more people are coming out, and the people that are coming out are not urban, white, male, highly educated people. They're actually disproportionately minorities from non-urban areas, and those groups among the gay population are precisely the groups that are most supportive of same-sex marriage compared to the folks in 1990. Why are they more supportive? Probably because, one, they do come from more traditional backgrounds. They're also probably more religious. They probably come from more traditional backgrounds and see marriage as the way couples interact. Secondly, to the extent that marriage is a kind of economic benefit, these are the folks that get the most out of it. As you know, if you are a highly educated urban couple and have a fair bit of money, you have the resources to create the legal agreements to kind of approximate marriage. A rural person, perhaps lower income, perhaps doesn't even have the access to the kind of legal acumen to do it, and secondly, perhaps doesn't have the money to do it. And marriage for them is a kind of an economic outlet. They probably also have less access to things like domestic partner benefits, health insurance, things that are probably more likely in a marriage scenario. So my simple argument is that I think that while public opinion is an important element to think about in shaping public policy, I also think that kind of public opinion and the demographics of the gay community itself and those changes are really important in thinking about what's changing public policy on the issue around marriage equality. So thank you.
Great, thank you. 3 very interesting presentations. So we have about 10 minutes for questions, and I'll just call on people and kind of go around the room. Yeah.
I don't know how you deal with this methodologically, but one factor that, just from personal experience, I found makes a difference is how well informed people are about the issue itself. For instance, I'll be brief, but this morning I had a conversation with my next door neighbor, a straight woman. I told her I was coming to this conference and some of the things that might be discussed. She was surprised to hear that our domestic partnership rights don't include joint tax returns. She was surprised to hear that the people who were promoting this initiative tried to disguise what it would actually do. She didn't know much about it. By the end of the conversation, she was much more strongly in favor of all rights than she was at the beginning of the conversation, just by knowing some details of what we do and don't have and how the other side operates. Is there any, and I know these polls are very short and people don't have a lot of time to answer them, but is there any way to get some data on the effect of knowledge about the issue itself on people's opinions about the issue?
Well, you can actually disaggregate some of those questions, right, so that the number of people who are in favor of inheritance rights or, tax treatment, what are some of the other questions that are is healthcare benefits is always much, much higher than you're going to get for civil unions or domestic partners. So we know that. So, if it's framed in that way, Now, the other interesting thing that we found is, what percent of the American population knows that it is legal to get married for same-sex couples to get married in Massachusetts? Less than 25%, okay? And so the issue of same-sex marriage, as it's thrust on the agenda, is not necessarily one that is completely informed about what is actually happening out there, but it is. On marriage, it's relatively easy to understand, right? I mean, at least that they can have some kind of guttural reaction as opposed to some of these other public policy issues that might be more complicated. But you're right that if you break it down into its individual rights, you're going to get much more favorable public opinion reaction than if you have just some slogan that people don't understand.
Did you want to? Okay. Yeah, I saw your hand next.
Actually, I was going to ask this of Mr. Guerrero last time, but I think it applies here. Given the changing landscape, both nationally and internationally, in the last couple of years since the election, do you think that the gay marriage issue will become more or less of a wedge in the next presidential election in 2008? Because on one hand, one might want to use that as a distraction from other more real problems. Then on the other hand, are people dealing with the other problems so that they're not as concerned about it?
Well, I mean, on the polling data that asks people whether it's important to their vote choice, you get a pretty small percentage that say it's important to it's sort of the critical decision for them. And because the truth is, if you're gung ho against same-sex marriage, you're probably voting Republican to begin with. Is sort of mostly going to be the story. Now, when you mention the international effects, one of the interesting things is that this pattern of backlash is not what we find in Canada, and we're trying to mess around with the Canadian data also, that there's a relatively monotonic effect, right? So the story we're telling here is not something about how courts affect public opinion. It's about how this court and this media and these decisions affected public opinion. And in Canada, it didn't have that effect, and the Canadian population has kind of gone along with the court opinions, and because elites have come out more in favor of it. Also, the story that I told about the ideologization of the conflict and the issue suggests that the backlash in the future should not be as pronounced as the backlash as it was. Now, that the reason being that it doesn't mean that there's going to be rising support for same-sex marriage, but it suggests that, when an issue is fully ideologized, right, that it means that liberals have people have sort of sorted themselves out. All right, doesn't mean you're going to get. I mean, the truth is, look, only 15 to 20% of American people call themselves liberal, so this is not cause for celebration here. But you can't, one should expect that, all right, now that people's opinion on same-sex marriage maps onto their ideological preferences, the effect of media attention, because education is less of a predictor of their opinion on same-sex marriage, should go down.
Okay.
I mean, I guess I think it depends on how the politicians play it. I mean, it seems to me that we're looking at another decade of minimal movement in public opinion on gay marriage, and so whether it plays as an issue, I don't know, but I don't see us winning the public opinion battle anytime soon.
Excuse me. Yeah. I'm just trying to make sure we get at least one from each of the different triangles. There's a whole bunch of people who wanted to ask questions. We aren't going to be able to get to everybody, unfortunately. Yeah.
Nate and Greg, you've looked at education as a predictor on the gay marriage issue. What about issues such as wealth or international travel, holding a passport, things like that?
We both looked at it.
I actually don't look at income, and things like international travel and having a passport I'm actually not aware of any data set that's got those measures in there.
Well, we have income on ours, and once you control for education, the effective income pretty much drops out. Passport questions we don't have, or something like that. But urbanicity has an effect in the aggregate, but that also, once you control for religiosity and you control for some of these other things, then that also doesn't seem to have an effect.
Okay, we'll have maybe time for another quick question from them.
Just quickly, because last time I was at this event, I was the executive director of what was called CAPE then, and now it's Equality California. And I just wanted to bring up and throw in these numbers that when I was here and did the panel, the question was, what were we going to do in Sacramento, domestic partners, civil unions, or the marriage bill? And the way we packaged that, not just in Sacramento, but across the state, was we would introduce domestic partners, which was Carol Megan's AB 25, but we also had a bill, a civil unions bill, and we had a marriage bill in the can. And the plan was to set that up so that domestic partners would be old hat, and yes, we got that, and that people then would get worried about the marriage bill, and we would do the civil unions bill. And so when the question comes up about, are we ready to push the marriage bill? I mean, the right wing brought that on us, but that's where we're at. And we've done this, evolved over long periods of time. When I worked for Harry Britt in San Francisco, and we did the registration, so where else do we have to go if we don't push it? And if we don't change the minds of the people, it's just not going to happen. And those numbers are going to go up and down and up and down, but it's amazing what you all have done.
Great. Well, okay, let's see, one more from the middle side here.
What's happened to public opinion in Massachusetts now that people down here who live with same-sex marriage?
Yeah,
We've looked
that's a
at
good
that.
question. Yeah.
We're going to put that in. We'll put the Canadian data and the Massachusetts data in here. The story with Massachusetts actually is not much different than the rest of the country, except they start off more supportive, okay, and they end up more support. They end up where they were before. So majorities are in favor of same-sex marriage in Massachusetts, but they started off higher than the rest of the country. That's at least our initial crack at the data have shown.
Did you see the backlash effect in?
Yes, there was somewhat of a backlash effect also, but people have sort of returned to earth.
But curiously, from the legislative side in Massachusetts, right after Goodrich, it was split dead even, and a year later, it was, what was it, 60-40 or something? It was a much more sizable majority of legislatures were willing to support same-sex marriage.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks to the panel.